Inside of today's video, I'm going to be ranking all 65 brawlers in the game right now, and also Willow, so technically 66 brawlers. But by getting this tier list, I've been looking through all the competitive data, looking at the win rates, play rates, and also the ban rates. Playing a bunch of Power League myself, grinding, of course, on ladder as well, getting masteries. So there's a lot of time put into this. It's literally took me like five days or so to get all of this data. So before we jump into the video, make sure you use my creator code. That'd be greatly appreciated. And without further ado, let's jump into it. So starting off in the F tier, we have Willows. So if Willow was released today, of course she's not, she's released in a month's time, I think she would be literally the worst brawler in the game. The main reason being is because of her poison tick damage. It feels so incredibly awkward. A lot of times you're just going to end up getting traded out, or they're actually just going to kill you before you can even get that poison effect in. I think she's really lackluster, and her super isn't even as strong as I think it will be. So I think Willow will actually be the worst brawler in the game. So next up in the F tier, we have Eggo. So Eggo still hasn't improved, even with somewhat throwers becoming a lot more prevalent in the meta. Eggo, of course, hard counters them pretty nicely, but overall it's just too difficult to use Eggo. You know, there's so many brawlers in the game right now where he only has a good matchup against a few of them. So of course, with over 60 brawlers, there's going to be a way that Eggo just gets hard countered. So for me, he still isn't its strongest, but still used sometimes in competitive on pit stop. Next up in the F tier, we have Shelly. So still, Shelly is still pretty bad, even with a lot more tanks being prevalent with unbreakable walls. I think unbreakable walls have actually made Shelly worse. She doesn't get as much value out of her super a lot of the time, especially if you're in a power position. You can't always use that super, and for me, it's just never used in competitive. Just way too risky to use. Next up in the F tier, we have Mr. P. So Mr. P, again, just has never been picked in Power League or competitive whatsoever. There's never really a reason to pick Mr. P. I think the only way I'd pick him, maybe to counter the likes of Genie on double swoosh. I don't know, he's just so weak, especially on ladder. There's so many aggressive brawlers, and just literally every brawler can just run into Mr. P's face and take him down. He definitely is in need of quite a few buffs. Next up in the F tier, we have Frank. So Frank, again, I feel like has actually been hurt by unbreakable walls. A lot of times you're behind an unbreakable wall, you've got your super, but of course you can't use it, so then you've got to expose yourself, and you don't have as much value with your super. So of course that's probably the best thing about Frank, and he was often actually used in draft, well, not often, sometimes used to counter likes of Ashe, but now with all these unbreakable walls, he isn't as good as a counter anymore. So next up in the F tier, we have Chester. So Chester is a brawler which you guys probably know I've got a profound hate for in this meta, because I just feel like he's terrible. Whenever I've got a quest with him, it just goes terrible. So a lot of the times it feels like you're doing something with Chester, but more than likely you're not really doing too much. A lot of brawlers can actually beat him in a 1v1. It takes him so long to get his supers, and his supers aren't even that great anymore. And I don't remember the last time I seen him in Power League or competitive as well. He just has a 0% pick rate. Next up in the F tier, we have Gale. So Gale, ever since his nerf not too long ago, he's just been getting worse and worse in the meta. Even if the meta was just literally tanks, it still would be pretty bad, because I feel like tanks actually have somewhat of a matchup against him. As long as you get rid of his gadgets, it takes him so long to cycle his super now. So I just feel like there's a lot more brawlers that just serve his purpose now. It can be somewhat underrated on more longer range maps, but still, Gale is just never picked when it comes to competitive. Next up in the F tier, we have Colt. So Colt has been much worse in this meta. Unbreakable walls have really hurt him, especially with his gadgets and his supers. Before, he could just break open the map slowly and literally make it a wide open map. But now with unbreakable walls, it's pretty hard for him to really do anything. I've seen so many clips of people just failing with Colt, because he's not really the best in the meta right now. He still can be somewhat useful on the more open maps perhaps, and even sometimes in heist on the likes of Bridge Too Far, but still in this meta he's definitely hurting a lot, and hopefully he does receive some type of a buff, because all of his mechanics are just pretty useless right now. So next up in the F tier, we have Tara. So Tara right now just isn't used whatsoever in competitive. So many better options. I thought unbreakable walls would actually be an indirect buff to her, but still she's not picked whatsoever. You can still play her sometimes in gem grab and Ruble on ladder and still get somewhat of a decent win rate, but overall she's not competitive whatsoever. Pretty much every lane just tends to beat her. And lastly, in the F tier, we have Mortis. So Mortis actually improved a little bit in the meta, mainly because of those throwers. You can get some good usage out of him, especially in Ruble on ladder, because there's just so many throwers like Dynamite and Brawl. So Mortis, of course, can have a really good matchup there, but he still struggles a lot. Again, there's just so many brawlers in the game that have so many stun mechanics, slow mechanics, all of this stuff that just makes it really hard to play a good Mortis, but still he's improving a little bit just because of the meta around him. So there you have the F tier brawlers. So these brawlers are just terrible in the competitive meta. So now moving on to the D tier, we have BB to begin with. So BB in Ruble and Heist can somewhat be okay, but again, there's just so many counters for a brawler like BB. A lot of times it really depends on a good matchup for her to really do anything. Again, there's only a few maps which can really play around, like Pit Stop in Heist and a couple of Ruble maps. So next up in the D tier, we have Buster. So Buster has really been killed with the nerfs he got a couple of months ago. He was literally the best brawler in the game, but these nerfs killed him. He's only really strong in some aspects in Ruble, and then I've only really seen him play competitively in like Canal Grande, for example, but he's just so easy to take down, and in a 1v1 he really deals no damage anymore. A lot of times you have to free shot so many different brawlers, whilst other brawlers can just have much of a bigger impact. The next up in the D tier, we have Bull. So Bull still is pretty bad within the meta, even with these unbreakable walls. Hasn't really helped him out too much because he just gets taken down too easily. He still has a little bit of a place in the competitive meta in maps like Pit Stop and Center Control in Power League, but still is so easy to take down and really predictable because of his super. Next up in the D tier, we have Jessie. So Jessie's improved a little bit in the meta because of unbreakable walls. She gets a little bit more value behind them with her turret, and she's still pretty weak in those 1v1s because of a lack of damage she puts out, but I've seen her a little bit more in competitive, especially in Ruble and Hot Zone, where you can just get so much value out of her slows, and she's still a decent counter to those tankier brawlers, but overall Jessie still isn't the best. Next up in the D tier, we have Rosa. So Rosa still isn't the best of brawlers right now, even with unbreakable walls. I feel like Vision Gear just really kills her and her uniqueness. She wants to be really sneaky. Vision Gear doesn't allow that, but anyways, in terms of her viability within the competitive meta, she's actually a really strong pick on sneaky fields. She's an amazing counter to a lot of tanks like Ashe, for example. He will literally win that 1v1 every single time, but still there's a lot of brawlers that can just scout her out, and of course that's her biggest strength, being sneaky. So next up in the D tier, we have Jackie, and if we're talking strictly ladder, Jackie's actually a really strong brawler on Ruble or just any map with a lot of unbreakable walls. It's going to be pretty hard to get Jackie behind the wall, but competitively speaking, we don't really see Jackie too much. Maybe on Canal Grande behind those unbreakable walls, but other than that, she's just get countered a little bit too easily. But as I said, on Ruble, on ladder, she's so hard to take down, especially on maps like Field Goal. So next up in the D tier, we have Leon. So Leon often is overlooked, and I feel like he actually is pretty underrated, but still, the Vision Gear is just too strong. It still scouts him out whenever he's in his super or whether he's in his gadget as well. So of course, the best thing about him is just completely countered by literally a gear. So it's pretty hard to play Leon within this meta, but still there are some instances where he can definitely be a really strong pick and people may really underestimate him. So next up in the D tier, we have Byron. So Byron still isn't the best brawler in the competitive meta right now. We're definitely seeing a big increase in his usage rate in terms of more passive maps, like especially in Bounty, Knockout, where he's safe behind multiple other brawlers. He can be somewhat useful for his team because of the reload speed buff, but still I feel like it's too easy to take down right now, and it still isn't in a competitive meta. Next up in the D tier, we have Bo. So the rework to his totem actually hurt him quite a fair bit in the meta, mainly because of the knockout cheese. You could literally synergize him with any brawler, which was good with a super and knockout, and it was just 3 wins on ladder. But to begin with, he's only really like okay across the board. Like, he's not a terrible brawler, but competitively speaking, he isn't used pretty much anywhere except for maybe on harder at mine to counter the likes of 8-bit. And lastly, in the D tier, we have your mom. So Pam, unfortunately, isn't the greatest. After grinding to get your mom for the longest time, she was just terrible everywhere. I really had to sweat it out for hours on end with terrible win rates to push Pam. She was only really decent on Hot Zone. That was literally the one game mode where I thought, you know, Pam's actually pretty strong there. She's okay on Knockout and okay in Gem Grab, but there's just a lot of better brawlers out there. And competitively speaking, I've only really seen her in Hot Zone. So there you have the D tier. So these are brawlers that are sometimes used and have their specialities in countering certain compositions, or just have like one map which they're particularly good at. Okay, so starting off the C tier with Barley then. So Barley is increased a little bit in the meta. Probably a lot of people would have thought that Barley was surely one of the best brawlers in the game right now, but there's not that many unbreakable walls. There's a few maps in particular where he might be incredibly strong, like Field Goal or just literally any map with a lot of unbreakable walls. But for me, Barley just is really lackluster. It's not really used in competitive too much. Maybe on Pit Stop I've seen him used a few times, or maybe as a last pick on maps like Super Beach, but still I feel like it's really vulnerable and it's quite easy to be aggressive and take down a ball. So next up in this C tier, we have Griff. So you guys might be really surprised by this one, but Griff, ever since Unbreakable Walls, he's just had no use in competitive. I've not seen him used once in my data. He wasn't picked once or banned once. So of course, Griff's going to be a lot worse in this meta. And I just feel like, again, it's the unbreakable walls. His gadget was the best thing about him, breaking open the map and then synergizing Griff with a brawler like B. But now you can't really do that on site. You know, certain unbreakable walls, of course, people can just abuse and stay behind, and Griff can't really do anything. You pair that with the nerf he received to his supercharge rate, I feel like it's done a lot more damage than people realize. So Griff definitely is falling off a little bit. So next up in the C tier, we have Mandy. So Mandy is in the C tier because she's only really strong in a couple of game modes, which are bounty and knockout. Everywhere else, she feels a little bit awkward to use because the best way to use her is, of course, standing still and getting use out of her focused mechanic. So then you can outrange certain brawlers, and then cycling your super. A lot of times you can actually one-shot brawlers with his super, and his super can be really polarizing in game modes like knockout. Literally one kill can change the game. So that's why Mandy's incredibly strong on those two game modes, but then is really bad elsewhere. So next up in this C tier, we have Rico. So unbreakable walls have helped him a little bit in the meta, but still feel like he's definitely vulnerable to a lot of different meta brawlers in the game right now. But there's some maps where he's actually started to make a little bit of a competitive comeback, like Bell's Rock and Knockout, for example. Hard Rock Mine is still pretty good, and some certain Ruble maps on ladder, he can still be pretty easy to use, but overall Rico is still easily countered. So next up in the C tier, we have Sandy. So Sandy's damage buff definitely did help him out quite a fair bit. You now see him quite often in the Ruble competitive meta. Not used all the time, but definitely on some certain maps you can get such amazing value out of his main attack, just being able to wall peek pretty much all of the time. He's not really used in any other game mode right now, so I can't really put him above a C tier, but the damage buff definitely helped him out. So next up in the C tier, we have Colette. So you might be wondering, well, Colette is a very tanky meta, why isn't she much harder? She's not really used at all in competitive right now. The only time I've seen her being picked is on heist, maybe in a few ways if there's multiple high HP brawlers. I've seen her used sometimes as the last pick, but still she's too easy to take down in a lane and too risky to pull it off. But as I mentioned, she's insane on heist and still can be pretty strong in some other game modes. Next up in the C tier, we have RT. So RT is the newest brawler in the game right now. A lot of people still probably don't even have him unlocked, but I feel like it's a little bit of a weird one. I really struggle to put him in a certain place because sometimes it can feel really strong, especially on Ruble when you're behind a wall and you can literally one or two tap so many different brawlers in the game. But then when you're in his single shot form, it feels sometimes a little bit too weak. It feels a little bit awkward, and a lot of other brawlers will just beat him in a 1v1 because his projectile shoots really fast, but it's actually really slim. So I feel like he can have good potential in some ways, but still sometimes a little bit awkward to play. So next up in the C tier, we have Amber. So Amber pick rates haven't really been the best within this competitive meta, but I feel like she's actually often overlooked. She's a really solid option in Hot Zone. You're always going to get value out of her super, and she actually counters a lot of the meta brawlers in Hot Zone. And also she can be pretty good in some other passive maps as well, but overall she's not really having the biggest impact in this meta. Next up in the C tier, we have Daryl. So Daryl has seen a little bit more usage within this meta, mainly on knockout and also in heist. Unbreakable walls have made it a little bit more easy for him to, of course, you know, maps like Safe Zone, to stand behind him and just be a little bit more of a threat. But overall he's still not entirely the most meta brawler. So next up in the C tier, we have Buzz. So Buzz has gone from one of the best brawlers in the game, definitely like a top 10 in the last meta, to somewhat of just a middle brawler. He hasn't really been seen too much in competitive right now. I'm not too sure why personally, but he's not really the brawler he used wants to be. It's feel like there's a lot of brawlers like Surge, for example, that have just really risen, so it makes it a little bit harder to play Buzz because, of course, he gets completely destroyed by a Surge. So he's only been played a handful of times in competitive, but still in some scenarios, especially in heist, he can be somewhat of a decent last pick, you know, much like Safe Zone, and still in some areas he can be a good counter to a lot of the thrower brawlers. So Buzz, he probably is a little bit underrated right now. So next up in the C tier, we have El Primo. So El Primo, you might be wondering, why is he so strong? He's literally gone from like an F tier, D tier brawler to actually somewhat of a high pick rate brawler in competitive right now. He's really sore in terms of his usage rates. The main reason being is because of that small damage buff to his super damage, which was a couple of months ago now, but it's really helped him in this meta, really tanky meta. Of course, he's going to be countering those tanks, but not only that, his super is just so devastating right now, especially in Ruble. I've realized for a long time it's pretty hard to stop a good El Primo. He's been used a lot in heist right now as like even a first pick in like pit stop, for example, center control. He's a really solid tank right now. So next up in this C tier, you might be very surprised by this one. It is Gray. So Gray actually received one nerf, which a lot of people thought wouldn't really have done too much to him, but in terms of pick rates, he was actually only picked or banned once in all the data that I had. I had a lot of data, so it just goes to show that the pros really don't value Gray as a pick anymore. I'm not too sure why. Whenever I play him in Power League, it feels somewhat good. So this is mainly based on competitive, this ranking. Maybe he's very underrated, but I feel like he's only really strong in knockout, for example, because of that super. And when it comes down to ladder as well, it's still pretty hard to play him because he does lack a lot of damage. So next up in the C tier, we have Brock. So I predicted with Unbreakable Walls that Brock would definitely be near the bottom of the meta, but I still feel like he's a really strong brawler. Even on maps like Safe Zone, where there's a lot of unbreakable walls, where before he'd just get instant value with his gadgets breaking open the right hand side, he's still actually used quite often there because he just deals so much damage. He's a really strong option on knockout and bounty as well, so he hasn't really fallen off too much, but of course he won't get as much value as you would like. So next up in the C tier, we have Fangs. So he's really strong in bounty and knockout in particular. You see him being drafted quite often as a last pick to counter a couple of maybe throwers or those sharpshooters, because his super is just going to be so devastating against them. So he's only really good on those game modes, but still a good Fang can absolutely pop off anywhere. So next up in this C tier, we have Dynamite. So this is probably the most meta Dynamite has been in a very long time. The only thing that's stopping him from being any more meta is the fact that still tanks will have a good matchup against him, but there's been so many maps on Ruble in particular and also Heist where, you know, a face off against Dynamite and ladder, it's just so frustrating to face off against him. The best way of dealing with him a lot of the time is just by running away from him, because he can be so polarizing on those maps like Field Goal or just any Ruble map with unbreakable walls. Next up in the C tier, we have a Nanny. So although Nanny may not be this brawler that can just pick up and play everywhere, on certain game modes and maps, she's probably the golden pick, and that's why she's so high up in the C tier and probably a lot better than you may realize. So with Nanny, especially on bounty, we talk about Shooting Star, nowhere to hide. She's literally a golden pick brawler. When you go to knockout as well, in certain maps as well, like out in the open, she's a golden pick brawler. So I just feel like when she holds that much weight on a certain map, she has to be near the top end of C tier. And lastly in the C tier, we have Meg. So Meg is literally the best brawler in Hot Zone, so it's pretty hard really to rank her any higher because she's only really strong in Hot Zone. But anyways, Meg is just so incredibly strong, like the golden brawler when it comes down to Hot Zone. She'll just 1v3 and dominate once she gets her mech. She still can be okay in some other game modes, especially like Bridge Too Far and Heist, but still her niche is definitely Hot Zone. So there you have the C tier then. So these are predominantly brawlers that are probably good in a couple of game modes or just really polarizing on certain maps. So moving on to the B tier brawlers, starting off with Piper. So Piper, she's a really strong brawler within this meta on certain game modes, but Unbreakable Walls definitely have hurt her a little bit because normally with her super you could just break open, of course, every single wall. The more open the map, the better it is going to be for Piper, but you can't just use Piper everywhere now. You definitely got to be careful of those unbreakable walls, but she's still really strong on bounty, those really open maps, really strong on knockout, and then it often can be used in Heist and other game modes as well. So next up in the B tier, we have Squeak. So Squeak has definitely increased a lot in viability in this meta because of those unbreakable walls. So normally Squeak is starting to go down in the rankings because people are figuring out how to counter him. The way to counter him is by breaking up as many walls as possible. It's a lot harder to pressure people with Squeak if there's a basically the whole map is open. But now with unbreakable walls on some maps, he's going to get insane value. The walls are always there, so his gadget and his main attack is just going to get so much value out of it. So that's why you've seen a big increase in Squeak in this meta. Next up in the B tier, we have Nita. So Nita has always been a brawler that's only been good in a certain few game modes, but within this meta she's definitely getting a lot better because, again, a big counter to her used to be those wall breakers. She's of course lacks range, but now on certain maps she can absolutely thrive. Ruble and Heist in particular, you've seen a lot of Nita because she's just an easy flexible brawler. She can deal with tanks pretty well, but also she can win her matchup pretty well if there's a lot of walls. So next up in the B tier, we have 8-bit. So with the rise of tanks, 8-bit is going to be even better because as a mid, it's one of the few ones that aren't really countered by those aggressive brawlers. So always know you can rely on him on certain maps as a gem carry. You know, like Harder at Mine, you see quite a fair bit of him. And then in Heist, he's of course the king of damage. Literally one good attack with your super and gadget can literally win you the game. So you see him picked a lot in Heist, whether that's Safe Zone, whether that's Bridge Too Far, or any other game modes. He's not really picked too often in the other game modes, but can still be fairly decent. So that's why he's in the B tier. So next up in the B tier, we have Sprout. So Sprout has always been a pretty dangerous last pick in a lot of different scenarios, but even more so now with Unbreakable Walls. Of course, that's really going to help throwers and also really help with his super. His super can just really block off a lot of different choke points even more toxic right now, and especially on certain maps like Canal Grande, for example, he's seen a lot more Sprout, and he's a lot more protected, of course, by unbreakables on maps like Bell's Rock as well. So you know you can always get value out of Sprout, and it can be pretty toxic. So you actually see him banned out quite often in Bounty and Knockout. So next up in the B tier, we have Ruff. So I might be being a little bit harsh on him because I still feel he's pretty strong even with unbreakable walls, because in some scenarios he's still usable. Like his main attack, of course, benefits out of unbreakable walls, but of course, again, there's some maps as well where some really game-changing walls are unbreakable, so he won't get value out of his super, but he's still actually used quite often in competitive. In some maps, he's still an absolute golden pick. You know, Harder at Mine, for example, he's still really strong. Maps like Split and Power League, he's still a really strong first pick as well. And then just in general, in a lot of different game modes like Ruble as well, there's still some scenarios where his super's going to get insane value, so it's definitely worth picking him still. So next up in the B tier, we have Belle. So Belle is actually a really versatile brawler, actually often picked when it comes down to the drafts. She was actually picked, I think, the 5th most out of all the competitive data I have. So normally she escapes the ban list, so that's why she's obviously played quite a fair bit, but she's really versatile, really good on some hot zone maps, especially the more open ones like Ring of Fire and also Open Zone, because you get a lot of value out of her traps. Also just generically good, you know, in like Bounty, for example, if you're looking for an option, or just an option to counter the likes of B as well, because Belle will beat her in a 1v1, so she's still a pretty strong brawler within this meta. Next up in the B tier, we have Grom. So Grom received another nerf with the last set of balance changes. I still feel like it's a fairly strong brawler. You can't just go Grom everywhere now. Before the update, I used to just ban Grom everywhere because he was so toxic, but still, he can be countered a little bit right now. But in Knockout and Bounty, he's still one of the best brawlers quite easily, and just any map with unbreakable walls, you can still guarantee value with Grom. So next up in the B tier, we have Tick. So I thought he was basically the same as Grom in the meta. It's a little bit better on some maps like Shooting Star and Canal Grande, where at least his super can protect you against some of those aggro brawlers, but he's definitely got a lot better now. Tick was always that brawler, kind of forgotten a little bit within Knockout and Bounty. Now with unbreakable walls, he's definitely starting to shine again. And lastly, in the B tier, we have Eve. So Eve is actually an incredibly underrated brawler within this meta. I have really high win rates with her in Power League. People just kind of always sleep on Eve, but anyways, she's really strong as a first pick in a lot of the, again, passive game modes like Bounty. She's really strong on Canal Grande, also really good on Nowhere to Hide, the brand new Power League map, and also really strong in Knockout in general. I just feel like people are definitely sleeping on Eve. So there you have the B tier brawlers then. So these are some brawlers that are so good as like a golden pick in multiple game modes, and also you can pretty much pick up and play them pretty much anywhere. So now moving on to the A tier, starting off with Goose. So Goose has fallen a little bit within the meta because there's just so much aggression. Goose can't keep up in every single game mode, but on game modes like Knockout and Bounty, you still see him a little bit. In terms of Knockout, it's definitely his best game mode, but it's hard to ignore the fact that his play rates have gone drastically down. So for me, I really couldn't put him any higher. So next up in the A tier, we have Lou. So I think I overrated him a little bit in my top 10 ranking video, but I think from just playing Ruble a lot with ladder, I just saw how toxic Lou was. But in Ruble, he's absolutely insane. He can absolutely hard carry, and especially in hot zone as well. It's definitely a brawler that you can rely on in terms of a really good counter pick to so many of the aggro options. And if you're really good Lou, you can still consistently beat a lot of the other mid options in the game, like B, for example. So next up in the A tier, we have Spike. So Spike continues to be a thorn in a lot of people's side right now. He's such a consistent brawler, good against pretty much everything in the game. And I feel like unbreakable walls have actually helped him out quite a fair bit, just because the more walls actually normally means they're better for Spike, just because his shots can curve around walls, and if you keep your distance fairly well against throws, he can still pretty much thrive. A lot of brawlers, of course, can't shoot around walls, while Spike can, so he can be a super versatile option. So next up in the A tier, we have Lola. So Lola always goes through these periods where she's pretty strong / underrated, and then you don't barely see her, but again, Lola is actually one of the most picked brawlers within EMEA, literally the 4th most picked brawler in competitive. She's so strong in game modes like Ruble. She's a decent gem grab carrier as well, really good in heists for consistent damage, and used very often in hot zone as well. Her gadget's gonna waste a lot of ammo from the opponents, and she's a really good counter to a lot of meta brawlers like Stu, like Lou, B as well. She's going to waste so much ammo from them. That's why you've seen her picked quite often. So next up in the A tier, we have Sam. So his play rates have dropped a little bit since his nerf. It's definitely hurt him a little bit in the fact that he used to use his super to literally two-shot a lot of the meta brawlers, but still he's a really strong brawler when it comes down to a last pick on certain maps. And then any map with unbreakable walls, of course, he's going to get insane value because he's going to abuse walls as much as possible with his super. So Sam, it's still a really good pick in this meta. So next up in the 80, you might be very surprised by this one. It is Ems. So Ems' play rates in competitive have gone through the roof. She's also one of the most banned brawlers as well. Just going to show how much pros value Ems at a minute. So Ems has always been this flexible brawler, which is pretty much good against everything, but not only that, she completely shuts down tanks on her own. And also unbreakable walls, of course, are really going to help out Ems. Beforehand, you could go like a Griff or a Ruffs, break open a map, and make it pretty hard for Ems to really do anything because you can just outrange her. But now with unbreakable walls, she's going to get so much value out of her super, and she's such a strong brawler in multiple game modes right now. So next up in the 80, we still have Colt. So Colt has always been a fantastic choice in the meta for such a long time. There's been a few brawlers right now that counter him at the top of the meta, like Surge for example, but he's still a really good option. He's pretty much just good everywhere, every single map, every single mode. You can definitely get away with playing a Colt. He's such a good aggro pick right now. So next up in the 80, we have Surge. So we predicted it with our top 10 rankings that he's going to be in and around the top 10, and he definitely has. Even in competitive, he's thriving so well right now. Main reason being is because if you go Surge yourself, it just stops you from going so many different brawlers. A lot of the tanks, Surge just completely shuts down. Breakable walls are actually going to help him out a fair amount as well. And, you know, a good Surge can absolutely hard carry even at the highest level. So Surge is such a dominant pick within this meta. So next up in the 80, we have Stu. So Stu is such a versatile brawler within this meta. He's definitely thriving a little bit more because tanks actually help him out sometimes because he can get his super a lot easier. The biggest counter to him is long range, and there's not as many long range options within this meta, so the more he gets supers, the more he's going to be able to thrive and pop off. A good Stu can really do that in so many different scenarios. It's a really solid option everywhere in Ruble. Gem grab is being used a lot. Hot zone, of course, he's really dominating on right now, so good Stu can really leave his mark on the match. And lastly, in the A tier, we have gone with Genie. Couldn't quite put him in the S tier, but I feel like if you basically only play Power League or competitive, you can easily put him in the S tier. But anyways, Genie is a really strong brawler. He's one of the most picked and also one of the most banned brawlers because as a first pick in multiple game modes, he's so strong. His vision gear is just completely built for him. The mythic gear as well is game breaking in terms of changing the way the game is, especially in gem grab and Ruble. He can literally win you a game, a really good pull. And in Bounty and Knockout, he's one of the best picks as well. So just pretty much in 4 game modes, he's an S tier brawler. So there you have the A tier brawlers where they're going to be so strong in multiple game modes, and you definitely have to be wary when the opponent drafts these. So starting off the S tier, we have Bonnie. So Bonnie's play rates have gone through the roof with this update. Not too sure why she's exactly completely shining in this meta, but everyone is using her and a lot of people are banning her as well. So her strongest game mode is going to be Knockout. She's used quite a lot there. Also Heist as well. Even in Hot Zone, I'm seeing her used quite a fair bit as well. Pretty much everywhere I've seen a good Bonnie player making a big impact on the meta. She's pretty good against everything, right? Of course, tanks are going to be a downfall to her sometimes, but then again, it does feed her super. So overall, Bonnie is a strong brawler. So next up in the S tier, we have Ashe. So Ashe still is completely dominating within this meta. As you guys know, a good Ashe player can win pretty much every single matchup, especially with his rats, but still his pick rates are through the roof in competitive, and his win rates are really high as well because he's one of those brawlers that can absolutely carry. And a lot of people still underestimate an Ashe, and to be honest, there isn't really too many really hard counters out there at a minute. You know, Rosa and Primo having good matchups against him, but still he's one of those brawlers that you can't ignore. So next up in the S tier, we have Crow. So Crow is still a fantastic choice within this meta. Even since his gadget got nerfed, he's still really strong. So in terms of competitive, he was actually the second highest picked brawler within competitive, which is insane. Just going to show how versatile he is, but not only that, how strong he is. And also he's one of the most banned as well, so just literally proving it to you guys in terms of data how strong he is. He's good everywhere, right? Really strong in Ruble as a lane or a mid. Super easy to scout the grass with his main attack, and of course the super can completely change the game. Same with gem grab. Even on some unconventional maps, he can go as a mid or even as a lane, especially with that jump, just countering so many brawlers. Also Hot Zone, he's a fantastic brawler. So Crow is just so good at countering so many different compositions. So next up in the S tier, we have Janet, and still, ever since her release, I don't think she's gone outside of the S tier. She's such a strong, flexible pick. She was actually the second most banned brawler in my data as well, just going to show that everyone values Janet in the draft because she's so good against everything. You can literally never go wrong with her because she's, again, good at pretty much into everything. She's got a really strong gadget. Her super can get her out of sticky situations, and her damage can often be really underappreciated because as time goes on, we'll be slowly chipping down brawlers pretty easily. Janet, she's just strong everywhere. There's literally an argument to go her in every single game. Next up, as the 5th best brawler in the game right now, we still have Poco. So he's received several nerfs within the past few months. His HP in this balance change, and he's still one of the best brawlers in the game. He was actually the highest banned brawler in competitive by a long stretch because of how strong he is on Ruble, how good he is in gem grab, and how strong he is in hot zone. It's literally guaranteed value with Poco every single time. And of course, he's good against everything, because if you want to counter a Poco, if you want to get close to him and take him down, you're just going to feed his super, and a good Poco can cycle his super so quickly. So he's still one of the best brawlers, and of course, unbreakable walls have helped him out quite a fair bit. So next up, as the 4th best brawler in the game right now, we still have Otis. Even though he receives nerfs pretty much every single update, is still up there in terms of pick rate. He's literally the most picked brawler in competitive right now because of his versatility. He's good everywhere, even in some game modes where you may think Otis isn't the best there. He's still used, like I see him used quite a fair bit in bounty, to be honest, which is quite surprising. Of course, he's going to be really strong in gem grab and Ruble, because that's where the majority of tanks are, and of course he's going to shut them down with his super. Even in heists, I see him used quite often because his damage is often underrated as well. Pretty much every single game mode I see in Otis, and that's why he's the most picked brawler and one of the best brawlers in the game. So now moving on to the 3rd best brawler in the game right now, we have Max. And Max is still continuing to be such a dominant force in the meta. The main reason being she's versatile, good with pretty much everything, and also just good at countering everything. Literally one max super can completely change the game and counter so many of those kind of control compositions. So that's why Max is so dangerous. She was actually the 2nd most banned brawler in competitive, and also the 3rd, or I think 3rd or 4th most played brawler. So just going to show how much people value her, because she's pretty much picked all of her time, and for me she's usable in every single game mode, so it has to be one of the best brawlers easily. So next up, as the 2nd best brawler in the game right now, we have Bees. So pretty much she's a top 5 brawler easily, but within ladder I think she could even be the 1st or the best brawler in the game, because she can completely dominate on multiple game modes and pretty much every composition. Bee is just so strong. It could be can literally 1v3, especially against those tanky compositions. Like no other brawler in the game can really do that. But in terms of competitive, she was used fairly decently amount. I think she was like the 5th best banned and the 5th most picked as well. In competitive, there's other ways to kind of counter her, but in ladder, she's so strong. And for me, she has to be one of the best brawlers in the game. Okay, so now moving on to the best brawler in the game right now. In my opinion, it has to be Penny. So Penny isn't a brawler which you can just go up and destroy people straight away. She isn't that type of brawler. Main reason why I'm putting her at number 1 is versatility. I judge mainly how good a brawler is, how good they are in every single game mode, and whether they'll get you that win pretty easily. And Penny definitely is one of those brawlers, because not only does she have a really good gadget, a really good super, just her main attack is just so easy to hit every single time, really consistent damage, and she's also like the 2nd most picked brawler in competitive, one of the most banned brawlers in competitive as well. So just going to show it in the draft as well, you can pretty much play Penny everywhere. You can play her as a lane, play her as a mid. Every single game mode there's an argument to go Penny, except for the really long range maps like Shooting Star, but still she gets value pretty much everywhere. Alright guys, it's gonna be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this one. This is the full tier list in its full glory, so if you're thinking about posting it anywhere, please give me some credit, because this took so long. Literally took me like 5 days full of research. Of course, multiple weeks of playing the game every single day for countless hours. So this is just my personal opinion as well. I'm bound to get a few things wrong. You know, my judgment of how strong a brawler is might be completely different to a lot of different people's. But, you know, mainly based this off competitive data and just my general feeling of how strong they are, especially when I'm in a 1v1 with them. So yeah, that's going to be it for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.